Nobody heard me come in. I had been away for 11 days, a fishing trip up near Kenora with my old friend from the mill, just the two of us, and a rented cabin on the lake. My wife knew I was coming back sometime around the weekend. I hadn't given her an exact day because, honestly, I was thinking of surprising her. Maybe I'd stop at that bakery on Morrison Street she loves and bring home those butter tarts she's been talking about since October. I was in a good mood. 11 days of quiet will do that to a man. I pulled into the driveway just after 7 in the evening. The lights in the living room were on. I could see the blue flicker of the television through the curtains. My son's car was parked crooked along the side of the house, the way he always does it, halfway onto the grass. His in-laws' SUV was in the street. A gray Traverse, I remember, one of those big ones. I sat in my truck for a moment, just listening. Through the window I could hear laughter. Loud, comfortable laughter. The kind that fills the room and doesn't leave space for much else. I got my bag from the back seat and walked around to the side of the house toward the back deck. I don't know why I didn't go straight to the front door. Something in me wanted a breath of air before walking into whatever was happening in there. That's when I saw her. My wife was standing on the deck, alone, facing the backyard. She had her arms crossed over her chest the way she does when she's cold, but it was a mild evening for November. She wasn't cold. She was holding herself together. I could see from 20 feet away that she had been crying. Her shoulders were hunched forward and she was very still, the way a person gets when they've been crying long enough that the crying has run out and what's left is just the weight of it. She didn't hear me walk up. I said her name softly, Helen. And she startled so badly she almost dropped her mug. She turned around, and her face. I don't have the right words for her face in that moment. There was relief and exhaustion and something I hadn't seen on her in a very long time, something that looked like shame. Not her shame, but the shame of having to tell me something she'd been carrying alone. She said, "You're home." And I said, "What happened?" She shook her head and looked back through the sliding door into the house. Through the glass, I could see my son, Kevin, sitting on the sofa with his father-in-law, Roger, a heavy-set man who ran a landscaping business in Barrie. They were laughing at something on the screen. My daughter-in-law, Tamara, was in the kitchen. I could see her moving around. My grandchildren, the twins, Lily and Ben, 4 years old, were nowhere I could see. Already put to bed, I figured. Kevin didn't glance toward the door once. I looked back at my wife. "Helen, tell me." She took a long breath and told me. It had started, she said, about a week after I left. Kevin and Tamara had asked if her parents could stay for a few days. Helen said yes, of course. She's not an unkind woman. And Roger and his wife Marion had stayed with us before at Christmas with no trouble. But this time was different. Marion had taken over the kitchen, not in a helpful way, but in a way that made Helen feel like a guest in her own home. She rearranged where things were kept. She used Helen's good Le Creuset pot for something that stained it orange. When Helen mentioned it, Tamara told her she was being oversensitive. That was the first thing. Then Roger started talking to Kevin about the house. Our house. A 4-bedroom place in Thunder Bay that I'd built up over 32 years, paid off the mortgage in 2019, not without sacrifice. Roger apparently had opinions about what the property was worth. He'd been looking things up online. Kevin told Helen that his father-in-law thought it made more sense financially for the house to be transferred into Kevin and Tamara's names while we were still alive to avoid probate. He said it like it was a sensible suggestion, like he was doing us a favor. Helen told him no. She was polite about it, but she told him no. That night, she heard Kevin and Tamara arguing in their room. Not the words, just the tone. And then it went quiet. The next day, Tamara stopped speaking to her almost entirely. Answered in one word. Didn't look at her directly. Answered in one word. Didn't look at her directly. Kevin pretended not to notice. And Roger and Marion sat in our living room every evening like they owned the furniture, eating food my wife cooked and watching our television and making plans I wasn't being asked about. Helen said she'd called me twice. I checked my phone later. Both calls were when I was out on the water with the radio off. I'd missed them. I hadn't thought to check until we got back to the cabin each night, and by then I'd seen no notifications and assumed everything was fine. She had managed alone for 6 days. I stood on that deck for a long time after she finished. I looked through the glass at my son. He was laughing at something Roger said. He refilled Roger's glass from a bottle. I noticed it was a bottle of Scotch I'd been saving, a 12-year Glenfiddich. I'd been given as a retirement gift 3 years ago. Kevin knew exactly where I kept it. He knew because I'd told him it was for a special occasion. He was pouring it for his father-in-law like it was tap water. I told Helen to go inside. I told her to say nothing about me being home yet. I asked her to take her time, go upstairs, rest. She looked at me carefully the way she does when she's deciding whether to trust me with something, and then she nodded and went in through the sliding door. I sat down in one of the deck chairs in the dark, and I thought for a long time. Here is what I knew. Kevin was 36 years old. He and Tamara had moved back in with us 2 years before, after a Reno project he was managing went badly sideways, and they found themselves with debt they couldn't carry and no lease anywhere. We had said yes. Of course we said yes. They had the twins, who were 2 years old at the time. We weren't going to let our grandchildren sleep in a problem, but we had made an arrangement. Kevin would contribute to household expenses, $600 a month, barely a fraction of what a rental would cost in the city. He would take over the driveway maintenance in winter, because my back had been giving me trouble. Tamara would handle her own family's visits, meaning they wouldn't stay longer than a weekend without asking Helen. In 2 years, Kevin had paid $600 exactly once. He told me things were still tight, that the landscaping business he was now working for, Roger's business, it turned out didn't pay what he'd hoped. I had said okay. I had let it go. My wife had never said anything to me about how much that cost her, to watch the arrangement evaporate while I made excuses for him. She told me later she didn't want me to feel foolish for having trusted him. I felt foolish anyway. That night I slept in the truck. I wasn't ready to walk through that door. I needed to think without anyone watching my face. In the morning, before anyone was awake, I drove to Tim Hortons and sat with a coffee and my phone, and I called my friend Dennis, who had retired from family law in Sudbury 2 years before. I'd known Dennis since we were young men. I trusted him absolutely. I told him what was going on. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he said, "Robert, nobody can force a property transfer. Not in Ontario, not anywhere in this country. Your house is your house. But I want you to be careful about how you handle this, because your son lives there and you have grandchildren involved." He told me to document what I could. He told me not to do anything in anger. He told me to call him again before I made any major moves. I thanked him and drove back home. I walked in through the front door at 7:30 in the morning. Roger was at the kitchen table in his undershirt, eating cereal, my cereal reading something on his phone. He looked up when I came in and had the grace to look startled. "Robert," he said, "didn't know you were back." "Just got in," I said. Kevin came downstairs 20 minutes later. He stopped when he saw me. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. More like recalculation. Like he was figuring out what version of himself to be. "Dad," he said. "Good trip?" "Good trip," I said. "We'll talk later." I didn't say anything at breakfast. I ate my eggs and I listened and I watched. Roger talked a lot. Marion offered to cook dinner. Tamara was quiet, watching Kevin, watching me, trying to read the room. Helen sat beside me and I noticed she put her hand on the table close to mine. Not touching, but close, the way you do when you need to know someone is there. That evening, after Roger and Marion had gone to pick up the twins from the community center where they'd been dropped off, I asked Kevin to come sit with me in the garage, just the two of us. I closed the door. I didn't raise my voice. I have learned at 64 that a quiet voice carries further than a loud one. I told him I knew what had been discussed with Helen about the house. I told him I knew about the Scotch. I told him I knew that the arrangement we'd made 2 years ago had never been taken seriously. Kevin started to explain. He started with the money, the landscaping business, seasonal work, a slow fall. I let him finish. Then I said, I'm not angry with you about the money, Kevin. I'm angry with you because your mother stood on the back deck last night and cried, and you were 20 feet away laughing, and you didn't notice. That's the thing I can't put down. He went quiet. I told him that Roger and Marion would need to find alternative accommodation by the end of the week. I told him I was calling a locksmith to change the codes on the garage and the secondary entrance, which only Roger had been using. I told him that I was meeting with our lawyer next week to update our will and establish a trust for the twins, separate from Kevin and Tamara, structured so that the money went to the children's education and could not be redirected by their parents. He looked at me like I'd said something in another language. Dad, you don't have to do all that. We can talk about this. We are talking about it, I said. This is the talk. I told him the house remained in Helen's name and mine. I told him that if he and Tamara wanted to continue living with us, the original arrangement would be reinstated and enforced. Not $600 once but monthly, on the first of the month, no exceptions. I told him that his in-laws were welcome to visit, briefly, when invited, and that any conversation about our assets or our property was finished permanently. And if we can't do the 600, he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. He was my son. He had my father's jawline and his grandfather's hands. I had taught him to skate on the lake behind my parents' house in Dryden when he was 3 years old. I remembered the exact weight of him on my shoulders when he was tired and small. Then you find somewhere else to live, I said, and we figure out how to still be family from a distance. But this arrangement, as it's been, it's over. He didn't say anything. He looked at the floor of the garage. I could see him turning it over. I left him there and went inside to find my wife. The week that followed was not comfortable. Roger was not happy about leaving. He made noises about it being sudden, about the weather, about Marion's hip. I told him I was sorry for the inconvenience and gave him until Friday. He left Thursday afternoon without saying goodbye to me, though he said something to Kevin in the driveway that I chose not to overhear. Tamara was cold to me for about 3 weeks. She was polite enough in front of the twins, which I respected. She kept to her side of the house. I kept to mine. Kevin surprised me. About 10 days after our conversation in the garage, he came and found me in the workshop where I'd been refinishing an old dresser Helen wanted restored. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he said, I owe you an apology. I set down the sandpaper. I waited. He said that he'd known, on some level, that things had gotten off track. He said that it was easier to let it go on than to face it. He said that Tamara's parents had strong personalities and he'd found it simpler to go along with them than to push back. He said he knew that wasn't good enough. He asked me how he could fix it. I told him to start by talking to his wife. I told him that the dynamic between Tamara and his mother needed to change, and that was a conversation only he could have. I told him that being in someone else's home, even his parents' home, required a basic respect that had been missing, and that it was his job to name that to Tamara directly, not leave Helen to manage it alone. He nodded. He stayed in the workshop for a while after that, not talking, just watching me work. I handed him a piece of sandpaper eventually. We worked on the dresser together for an hour and didn't say much, and it felt like something coming back into alignment, slowly and without ceremony, the way most real things do. I want to be honest, it didn't all resolve neatly. Tamara came around gradually, not all at once. There was a dinner in December, about 6 weeks later, where she and Helen actually laughed together about something related to the twins, and I noticed it and said nothing, just filed it away as a good sign. The $600 started arriving on the first of each month. Kevin did the driveway every snowfall that winter without being asked. Roger, I have not seen since he drove away Thursday afternoon. I don't expect we'll be close. I think he is a man who is used to running the room and didn't appreciate finding a room he couldn't run. That's fine. I don't need his approval, and I'm old enough to know I never did. The trust for the twins is in place. It's held at RBC and structured through our estate lawyer. An education trust that releases funds when Lily and Ben reach 18, administered independently. Kevin knows about it. Tamara knows about it. Neither of them has control over it. That was not a negotiation point. Helen asked me one evening, a few months later, whether I wished I had handled it differently. We were sitting on the back deck, the same deck where I'd found her crying, and it was a clear April evening, cold enough to need a jacket, but the kind of cold that feels clean. I thought about it. I told her that I wish I'd paid more attention earlier, that the signs were there, and I'd been too easy on Kevin because it was simpler than having a hard conversation. That I'd let myself believe the arrangement was working because no one told me it wasn't, and I should have asked. She took my hand. She said, "You came back." I said, "I always come back." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there until it got too cold, and then we went inside together. And that, more than any conversation I had in a garage or any call I made to a lawyer, that is the part I keep coming back to. Not everything breaks beyond repair. Some things just need someone to finally come home and look clearly at what's actually there.